Logical fallacies are false logic, and they are often confused with logical thinking. We need to be aware of these persuasive techniques because they are convincing oftentimes, because we need to be able to evaluate the arguments of others and determine if they're using false logic, and we also need to be aware of them so that we don't use them in our own argument. This is a list of logical fallacies. It is certainly not exhaustive, but it does give you a good example. It gives you a variety so that you can look at them. We'll look at another list or two in just a moment. Notice that some of them are in Latin. It's because the logical fallacies have been identified for a long time. The first one, ad hominem, is to the man. It's when we attack the person rather than the idea. The second one is when we make an illegitimate emotional appeal. We'll discuss that a little bit more. Ad populum, it appeals to prejudices or emotions of the masses. And if you watch the video of Tim James earlier in the semester, he was using an ad populum argument. The bandwagon appeal, the one that we use when we're trying to convince our parents we should get to do something, that if everyone's doing it, we should be able to. Or that if everyone's doing it, that it's a good idea. That we beg the question to pass off an assumption that needs to be proven. There are certain things that we assume to be true. However, there are some things, particularly as related to controversial topics, that we need to support. Circular reasoning is that the conclusion is hidden in the premise. A false analogy is when things don't match up. Sometimes I'll use an analogy and I may say it will fall apart. But if you show that two things are alike when the comparison does fall apart, when the two things aren't alike feature for feature, then that's a false analogy. A false dilemma is when there are only two choices, particularly for a complex issue where there are a variety of reasons and a variety of choices that are available. Faulty use of authority, when someone is an expert in one area, is used as an authority in an unrelated area. The Dr. Pepper commercials, Listen to Me, I'm a Doctor, is a play on this false use of authority. Hasty generalization, when we arrive at a conclusion based on too little evidence. Non sequitur, which is also a comic strip, draws a conclusion that does not follow logically. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, therefore because of this. Just because something happens after something else doesn't mean that the first is the cause of the second. A red herring is used to distract the audience. A slippery slope is when one event will happen and it leads to a chain of events. There's a current commercial campaign for, I believe it's cable TV, or persuading you not to have cable TV, where the character goes down a slippery slope. And stacking a deck is when we give only the evidence that supports our position and we don't look at the opposition. These are all logical fallacies, false logic, or bad reasoning. Let's look at them a little further. If you're in the essay website and you're in the page for logical fallacies, there are also these links, a definition, there are glossaries of terms, tips for avoiding them. In the philosophy course at Lander University, there is information about structure, syllogisms, symbolic logic. But we're going to look for just a minute at the LEO, Literacy Education Online site, because they have fallacies grouped by type of appeal. Logical fallacies may appeal to feelings. They may appeal to force, pity, an effect on a group of people, an appeal to authority that is not an expert in the field, an appeal to tradition, or an appeal to change, just for the sake of change. There are appeals that distract us from the argument when we attack the speaker, when we use irrelevant material, the red herring, when we shift the burden of truth so that the writer is in a position in which he or she can deny the opposition's assertions. It challenges those with an opposing view to defend their argument. A straw man is when we set up something that we can knock down very easily, when we don't give all the facts. Other logical fallacies fall into the category of misinformation. If there is from ignorance, when we have a false cause, when we start with something that is questionable, when we don't define our terms, when we simplify something very complex and look at it in such a simplified form that it's really not providing the information we need, when we start out with certain assumptions, and then when we use half-truths. Sometimes what we don't include is as important as what we do include. And in all of these cases, these are examples of logical fallacies. Another category is generalizations. Sometimes we use stereotypes, and particularly experiences. Remember that our evidence has to be reliable and representative. Make sure that it represents the whole and it is not just the part. So sometimes we generalize information in such a way that it is not good logic. Notice popularity. It bases the argument on the belief that if an idea is held by a large group, we called that the bandwagon effect earlier, that the writer applies a general rule to a case where the rule is inapplicable, that we have particular experiences to support a claim. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. The property in the whole, the writer makes a claim based on the belief that the whole always possesses the characteristics of its parts. Always and never are two things that we try to avoid because those typically are not truths. Property in the parts, that they assume that because the whole has a property, that the parts will have the same property. And a false alternative, that you only present the alternatives you want the reader to consider rather than all of the options. And finally, there are irrelevant connections. The slippery slope we've discussed, two wrongs not making a right, a false or wrong analogy, circular reasoning, the affirmation of the consequence, the denial of something that happened before. In these cases, what we do is we use what seems to be good persuasion that really is faulty, and these are called logical fallacies. These persuasive techniques are called logical fallacies. They are often very useful as far as persuading someone, but that doesn't mean that you should use them.